Today we are going to finally finish reviewing the First Law Trilogy by Joe Abercrombie by reviewing The Last Argument of Kings. If you've watched the other reviews, because I reviewed the first two books in that trilogy on this channel, then you know that means it's because I finally received the special hardcover editions from the Lit Escalates Kickstarter. So, first thing we're going to do, we're going to check that out and do an unboxing. So, I don't normally do unboxings. My apologies if the angle is a little wonky. I honestly thought it was kind of cool that the box came with the Lit Escalate seal over the main part of the box, like a seal to be broken. Everything seemed pretty secure in the box, though since nothing was damaged, it's not like I'm going to be looking to criticize it here anyway. The first thing I found was the cool little sticker and their thank you card, other than pulling out my little packing slip. Honestly, I forgot about the stretch goal items other than the slipcase, because I was really just looking to buy the book. After taking the book, one of the first things that I found once I got them unwrapped was this little package that contained the posters that were part of the campaign. Don't cringe too much as I use the knife to cut the bag open. I was being careful, trust me. I don't want to damage these things. They weren't cheap. I mean, I guess some people might think they were. I really didn't. Book 1's cover is pretty quickly explained since it is in the prologue, but I'm going to refrain from commenting on what the scenes actually are on the other books in case you haven't read them yet. Just as an aside, the poster for Book 1 is basically the very first scene in the opening of the whole series. So, of course, we didn't start with the poster for Book 1, just so you know. And now to actually get the books out of the slipcase. The quotes were actually voted on during the Kickstarter, so those were what the Kickstarter backers picked for the quotes. We'll show off Book 1 first, and like I said, that front cover is the very first scene of the book, so no real spoilers there. I'm extremely satisfied with these books. The art is beautiful. It actually feels nice to handle the books. The whole thing just physically feels well done. When you pull the dust jackets back, the books are this beautiful red with gold inlays for the title, etc. It's truly a really beautiful book, really well put together. And now the part that made me decide to back the Kickstarter to begin with, we turn a bit in and we have Abercrombie's signature and a pretty nice bookmark that goes with the book. Each of the bookmarks you'll see pop up, by the way, are specific to that book, so each book gets its own sort of gold embossed bookmark. I'll be honest, the way you're seeing me handle the books right here is probably the extent of it. I took them out one more time to let my wife see them. Other than that, I may pull it out for the review later. May not. You'll see here in a minute whether or not I'm actually holding the book that I'm reviewing. But I'll be honest, I'm never cracking these books. Like, they're never going to be opened in a way where they're going to be read. So unless my children happen to sneak downstairs and pull them off and build them all the way back, that's not going to happen. These are going to be treated more as a collectible. I have both cheaper physical copies of all these books and digital copies for actual use. So I've bought other copies for the sake of reading it comfortably. I don't need to break these open. I really did invest in these as just something to collect and throw on the shelf. Overall, I'm satisfied with what I paid for. The only complaint I would have is that the slipcase is a little bit tight, so it feels like I might damage them taking them in and out. But I won't be doing that very often anyway. Like I said, I'm not going to crack these guys. They're going to sit and just look pretty on the shelf. I hope I don't regret taking it out. Right off the bat, Last Argument of Kings is an exceptional end to a trilogy. This book truly made me understand why people put this series in the Grimdark arena. I still know of much darker universes, but there's no denying that this series fit into that category at this point. I absolutely recommend it. But let's be honest, if you've gotten this far in the series, if you've gotten this far in watching the reviews, you're going to read this book. Or you don't plan on reading them at all, and you're hoping that I'm going to give you a whole bunch of spoilers. That being said, while, like usual, I'm going to try to avoid big spoilers, it is genuinely impossible to have a worthwhile discussion about the final book of a trilogy, not a series. This isn't the end of the series, it's just the end of the first trilogy, without having some spoilers creep its way in, because the very nature of talking about the book is going to have that happen. Even the way I'm planning on actually breaking the review down is going to have spoilers to it. So this is your final warning. If you wanted to see the unboxing but don't want story spoilers, you need to click away now. And I really mean now. I'm going to give you a bit of a countdown on screen. And now we're going to start into the actual spoiler section. Last chance to back away. Alright. So the way I'm going to break the discussion down is by POV characters. Just to reiterate, the reason that's a big spoiler is because it's going to tell you whether or not someone survived from the last book to this one. So if you haven't read this one at all yet, or you haven't read the second book all the way through, you may want to stop now. I'm going to start with Glokta, then we'll go to Jezal, then Ferro, and finish with Logen. The reason I said this is a spoiler is because you've just learned that they all live at least to the beginning of this book. Now, there's no promises they make it all the way through, and I'm going to try to be as vague as possible when I'm discussing their section, but they have key enough importance in terms of this book that I think they are worthwhile to sort of break how I think the book is down. And I feel like most people would probably agree that other than Baez, or Baez, or however it's said, I'm going to say Baez. I've not heard anyone else say it, so that's what I'm going to go with. Other than him, there's not really that many other characters that would be worthwhile to bring up by name, but I think that will actually help us sort of describe how good the story is, or how bad it is. Alright, so Glokta first, because if you haven't picked it up from the first two reviews, Glokta was my favorite character through the whole series, and that still holds true in this book as well. I loved him because he was important to all the events going on, but it wasn't super obvious how for a very long time. You just knew that whatever he was doing was somehow related to the broader narrative, and it was always going to tie back together. So he seemed disconnected, but not really by the end. Or at least it seemed like he was connected more indirectly rather than directly to the story that the little fellowship from the first book sort of picked up with. It seemed like he was just going to be kind of tangentially related to them and maybe just keep you in touch with what's going on in the main empire while they were out doing their thing. That's not really the case. He was the person that Baez had the least direct connection with, and you were watching him constantly having to clean up someone else's messes. He presents himself as if he's the most immoral type of person, and don't take what I'm about to say wrong, because he definitely is, in some ways, a very, very immoral person. But he's also the most connected with feelings and the real consequences of his actions. He suffers zero delusions about what his position as an Inquisitor makes him do, and he doesn't pretend even to himself to be a good man. But he's good to other characters that I absolutely loved, and I couldn't be happier with the way he ended his story arc. I feel like his place in the story ends with him getting exactly what he deserves, and in a position that suits him infinitely better than where some of the other characters actually end out. The thing that I think is the most interesting about Glokta, and actually makes him a really good character and a good example of the quality of Abercrombie's writing, is that you really don't see him go through character development in a classical sense. You just see his character revealed one small scrape at a time. Internally, he is still probably the same character at the end of the trilogy as he was at the beginning, but it takes that time to really get to see the full sweep of his personality. You get to see him in a variety of different situations, how he reacts, and honestly, you could believe that the man from the very beginning of the story to the very end of the story, if dropped in at any given point, would probably have reacted the same way that he did throughout. So he's not so much developed as revealed, which is a really interesting take on character development, so to speak. Like, he doesn't undergo a whole bunch of personality changes or anything. You're just learning who he is. It turns out he's an interesting character already from the get-go. Overall, I love him. His personality, the way he approaches problems, and just seeing his plans unfold rather than being told what they are ahead of time. Like, when he comes up with a plan, it doesn't give you his internal monologue and let you see what he's planning on doing. You just have to kind of hope he actually has some sort of plan in mind, and there are moments in the story where you're thinking he's going to have a plan, and he really doesn't, and things just pan out the way that he says they're probably going to pan out, whether they're good or bad for him. And that's throughout all the books. He was an incredibly fun character, and every single time he was the theme character for a chapter, I would usually end up just reading all the way through that chapter, regardless of whether I had meant to stop and wait till the next day to do some more reading. So if I saw his name pop up or certain cues that he was going to be the theme character for that one in the first paragraph or so, I would usually end up reading an extra chapter before bed. Jezal. So, where to start with Jezal? Before I read the last book, I saw someone leave a comment, maybe on Goodreads, it might have been on Amazon, or maybe it was just under a different TikTok that wasn't one of mine. But this person left a comment saying that they were upset. They didn't really particularly like the third book because they felt like all the characters' development, like for all the characters, went backwards in the third book. And they specifically cited Jezal. They cited someone else, but we'll get to that too. But they mentioned Jezal as the big thing. They said, well, he's just back to where he was at the very beginning. Where did all this character progress go? I have no clue why they cited him specifically. I don't have any idea what they're talking about. I think they completely missed the point that Jezal grows into being a good person from being a selfish and arrogant person. But even from the first moment you meet him, he is being forced to do things that other people want him to do. In the first book, he is forced into the fencing contest. In the second book, he's forced into the trip with Beaz. During that trip, he ends out taking a massive wound to his head, and he's forced to sort of ride along while everyone else takes care of him right after he finally had the courage to step up and do something himself. So, he makes some growth and then basically gets sidelined. He gets humbled way more than anyone else in the series. And in this book, he gains the most possessive master that he's had throughout the entire series at this point. He has almost all of his autonomy basically stripped from him, and he knows there's not much that he can really do about it. I'm not going to spoil the big plot point for him here. You could probably guess it if you're clever enough and you've been sort of picking up on a few cues in the book as it goes. I'm going to spoil a big plot point for him here, but it happens pretty early on due to some of the positions he's forced into. He's no longer really allowed to pursue Ardy. I think they wanted his character to grow to the point where he just casts off any other responsibilities forced on him and pursues her. That doesn't fit the universe Abercrombie has built. That would actually really seem out of place in this world. And I'm actually infinitely glad that he did not do it. And it's not just for the reason some of you that have read the book might be thinking. It's because I genuinely think it made what happened with his character fall into that more realistic realm. There is magic and all sorts of unbelievable things that happen in these books, but at its core, it strives to have realistic consequences for the actions that the characters take, and have realistically presented personality traits for the characters in the books. Like, that level of realism is what makes it to where what happens to him happens to him. Jezal's part of the story was painful to read exactly because he was suffering. There's a certain point in the book where he basically stops being happy. And so, warning there, and it's pretty early on. Like, Jezal goes from what you see towards the end of the second book to a pretty miserable character. There is a brief moment near the beginning of his arc in this book where you can see a glimpse of the fear in him of committing to what he actually wants to do. and that fear does allow him to be forced into the position he finds himself in. But he never really chooses to abandon Artie and go on the road that he's pushed down. It's not so much him running away from her, getting what she thought he wanted and then running away. It's him having a moment of doubt, kind of going along with an opportunity to sort of go off on his own for a little bit and think things through. At least that's what he seemed to think was happening. And then realizing that all of his options have been taken from him. He learned and grew as a character to be put in a position where none of that growth is really able to be used by him, except in the most extremely limited way. And that makes the choices he has to participate in actually painful to him, because he's really impotent. And he knows it, and it chafes at him, as it would. The way he was at the very beginning, if he'd never really changed, and those of you that read the books will understand what I mean by this, he would have been nearly identical to Ladislaw in his behavior, except just a little bit better of a swordsman. So I think that's the whole reason why Prince Ladislaw existed, was to show you what sort of person Jezal could have been, had it not been for the things that he went through, and make you appreciate more or less where he ends out. So no, Jezal grew. He just had the best bad hand dealt to him that he could. He's not exactly in a bad position, especially if you've ever known any sort of want in your life, you're going to know what I mean. But it's not like he is following his own desires. Like, he's not going to starve or suffer where he ends out at, but he's not going to be happy either. Still, an excellent bit of storytelling and character development. So his arc, excellent as well. Now, for Ferro. By this book, I'd actually come to quite like her. I compared her to West and how I somewhat flip-flopped on them from the beginning of the first book to the end of the first book. But, by the way, as a small aside, West is totally redeemed by the end of this book, so I'll just throw that out there. He's not a full-time POV character in this one, which is why he doesn't get his own section, but he does get redemption. Anyway, Ferro is one of the coolest characters in the whole series by the very end of it. She is basically superpowered without really being superpowered. Well, maybe without really being superpowered. Anyway, she's a very strong character, and another that I believe the aforementioned comment was referencing when they tried to say no character growth. By the way, she's also one of the coolest female characters I think I've ever read. She's very different than any other female character that I've actually come across in any book series. Like, there was no concern about trying to preserve femininity with her. It was just what happens if you strip all of the humanity from a person bit by bit through basically torturing them and leave them just wanting supreme levels of revenge. And I believe she is a character that ends out in the same place anyone would end out had they went through what she went through. Her character growth is probably one of the most significant because while her personality doesn't really change, she learns just a tiny dash of self-control, which was her biggest weakness. Had she had that little bit of self-control, probably would have never really ended up being recruited to go into this whole campaign with Bayaz. Realistically, she is the character with the least reason to change and the most motivation to stay the same. She does actually grow by becoming more cunning and capable of restraining herself. But she is the character that is actually the most used, really. She's also the character that I'm most interested in seeing what happens with her after the book ends. I have zero idea if she ever shows up again in any of the other books in this series. There's 6 other books that I'm aware of set in this universe. 3 of them are side stories, and 3 of them are, I think, a direct sequel to this series. I have no idea what happens in those. I don't know if she just never shows up again. I actually really want to know what happens to her, though. At some point, she stops really being a participant in this book. And I'm not going to reveal why or how, but given the nature of her that you find out in the second book, there's a whole bunch of ways that her ending could potentially have gone. And I am definitely curious what happens with her. So I really want to see her pop back up. As a bonus aside, It's interesting how Bayaz's character has changed from the first book to this one. Hell, I was comparing him to Gandalf in the first review. I wouldn't dare do that now. He is... Let's just say by the end, you realize he has way more in common with Glokta than he does Gandalf, or than he ever had with Gandalf. But he makes Glokta actually look kind of gentle. He's also much more like what I would imagine a centuries-old being to be like. Like, there's a mistake that you make in the first book, which is you see him described as looking like an old, bald man. You see the way he behaves, which is like an old, bald man. And you really don't take his magic as seriously as you should. And you really don't think about the fact that he's been alive for centuries until you get to this book. And you start realizing what that much amount of time alive has probably done to him. And you learn a little bit more about his backstory. That's how we're going to talk about with Bayaz, because he's not a POV character. Now, Logen Ninefingers, or should I say, the Bloody Nine. We started the series with him as our first perspective chapter, and we'll finish the review with him. Seems like a fun way to take the series whole circle in the same sort of way that the books are done. Logen, like Ferro, had very little reason to change much about himself across this whole book series. There's some interesting peeks behind the mask with Logen, and one question that keeps popping up in my mind is which one of his two personas was the real man? And that's really sort of the theme across this book, is which one of them is the real him. And I'm not sure he's 100% certain either up until the very end. Logen Ninefingers, the survivor of multiple wars and the regretful man that wants peace and quiet, or the Bloody Nine, as capable of killing friends and children in his battle rage as he is of killing his enemies. He's the character I like the most at first. Probably at least partially because he's the first character that you introduce to. But he's the one I'm most conflicted about now. I'm not entirely convinced that his berserker rage is completely overwhelming and out of his control, so much as a state he works himself up into and has built his own sort of rule set around. After all, he never actually attacks Ferro when he's in one of those rages, and he's around her twice when he goes into them. And it seems to me like he has these rules that are established not by the Bloody Nine, but by his regular persona. And it just lets him justify kind of letting loose and just doing whatever. So I'm not completely convinced that he's that much out of control of the Bloody Nine part of it, so much as he just sort of works his way into it. He's a very well written character, basically starting the narrative presented as being known for being bloody and brutal, but taking it until this book to really prove why he has that reputation. Let's just say one last thing about Logen. The first book and the second book, you see him in pretty relative isolation. In the third book, you actually see him dropped back into the north. And you start seeing that everyone around him really is afraid of him. Even some of his friends really seem to be afraid of him. So, food for thought. Overall, I'm incredibly satisfied with this trilogy, and only regret not having read it sooner, because I've been aware of Joe Abercrombie for a very long time. I enjoyed every page. I couldn't wait to get to the next book each time I would finish one. The hardest thing now is going to be to set aside the series and read other books from other authors to do reviews on, so I don't just become an Abercrombie fan page that also does video game stuff. Although I'm really enjoying the book I'm reading right now, and I'll explain that in a moment. Oh, and there was a hint in the Kickstarter package, you may have seen this if you watched the unboxing portion, that Best Served Cold is their next project. I don't know if they're going to do one book at a time going forward or the whole trilogy again, but I'm down for it whenever they launch it. I'll back it, and it'll give me a good excuse to start doing those books as well. It'd be nice to get all 9 of them in this style print or better. There were some things I couldn't get this time around that I hope if they do another of his books they'll be able to get. Anyway, now, what's coming next? I'm currently reading Tavern by Destin J. Munden, one of my top 5 authors at this point. Recipes for an Unexpected Afterlife. Top tier book. It's a 10 out of 10 that you really need to read. It's not a you should read, it's a you need to read. After that comes The Other's Eyes by J.W. Mobley. Then I'm going to dive into Dungeon Crawler Carl again. I've just decided that for the channel, I want to primarily focus on smaller authors and that people may not have heard of. So stuff like Dungeon Crawler Carl series and the rest of Abercrombie's books are going to take a back seat. At most, they might just be read for fun. And if I happen to really need something to review for the month, then I'll put it out there. Book reviews anyway are also somewhat infrequent on my channel. It's a whole lot easier to put together video game stuff than it is books. Books take a lot more time to work their way through. I don't have any clue how some of these people put out 5, 6, 7 book reviews in a month. Kudos to them, especially the ones that read these gigantic books. Anyway, thank you for tuning in, and I still can't think of a good sign-off for this like I have for my video game stuff. If I can read it, so can you. Although that's not strictly true. Good night.